All right, friends, my pits are sweating. I'm out of breath. I just finished this episode with two of my favorite podcasters in the entire world. So please go ahead and forgive me now when you hear me stumble over myself, fangirl, and just try to ask all the questions I can in this short episode. I am interviewing the ladies from Sinisterhood podcast. It's going to be episode 136. So as always, you'll find the show notes at rachelbranky.com/EPI 136. Come in with us. You're going to learn all about podcasting, how to start, monetizing, dealing with reviews, Patreon, and so forth. If you've been thinking about podcasting or even just content creating, whether it's YouTube, blog, book, anything, this has great information for you. Plus, you get to see me off my game a little bit. So come on and let's listen.
Welcome to the Business Bites Podcast, the podcast for busy entrepreneurs. Whether you're an online entrepreneur or seeking after brick and mortar success, this podcast brings you quick bites of content so you can learn and grow anywhere you are. Now here's your host, Rachel Branky.
Hey, before we get into the episode, just a quick heads up. Because y'all are great, awesome, amazing listeners of the Business Bites podcast, you get a special discount through my law firm. Anytime you head over there to do some brand protection, such as trademark registration, copyright registration, or just need some help with contracts, let them know that you came from the Business Bites podcast and we will get discounts applied for you. Particularly, our trademark applications are $500 off for Business Bites podcast listeners. So just let the team know and you will get a discount, and you'll also get to hang out and talk with me and keep your brand protected.
Hey y'all, welcome to another week of the Business Bites podcast. My name is Rachel Branky and you're in for a real treat today. We have celebrity podcast guests, the duo from Sinisterhood podcast, Heather and Christy. I'm so excited to have y'all.
Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, my y'alls are already slipping out because of the
I love it.
Awesome. Well, I am a huge fan. A lot of the listeners are big fans. I want to start from the very beginning, how you got into podcasting. I'll throw it to either of you that wants to talk about how I know your childhood friends connected with each other, but how did you really think to dig into crime and comedy?
Well, we're actually not childhood friends, although we're children at heart. We met, what was it, Heather?
2016?
2016, yeah.
Yeah.
2016, we met through Dallas Comedy House, which is where we both performed regularly. And at the time, a docuseries was out called The Keepers. I don't know if you watched that, Rachel, on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really intrigued by it and how these women were solving these cold cases. And I kind of started talking to my husband and I was like, do you think there are book clubs, but instead it's just people sit around and talk about murder and colds? And he was like, I don't know, but you could start one. And I was like, that's a really good idea. So I reached out on a Facebook group through Dallas Comedy House that's it's an all women's group, and I kind of just put it out there, hey, does anybody want to sit around and just talk about this stuff? And Heather was like, hell yeah, I do. And we got together, and at first we didn't really have the intention of it being a podcast, although we did record it just in case anything fun happened. And it was kind of that's the way it got started. And as the ball started rolling, we decided we should probably get like a format together and figure out our roles better and everything. And that all kind of fell into place around episode 13.
I love it. Well, and it's funny, like the whole childhood thing, and you're like, oh, it was just a couple of years ago. And I'm like, dude, pandemic feels like it's been like 30 years.
True.
So
yeah, we're all 75 years old now.
Oh my God, I feel it some days. But we'll get to talking a little bit about pandemic and how that's impacted your podcasting. You all got into this talking about crime, improv, comedy. And if y'all haven't listened, by the way, to Sinisterhood podcast, it is hilarious. I listen to y'all on my long runs and I'll just start laughing like maniacally running down my street and like partnering that with like serial killer talk. And my neighbors are like, what the hell is going on? But it's funny. And I love learning, which sounds kind of really weird. I love learning about serial killers, and you guys don't even do just serial killers, it's all crime stuff. And we've got cults, and what are some of the other topics that you guys touch on?
Well, we kind of try to cover anything that interests us, and usually it's something that's more of the macabre, but or it has like legal issues or things like that. Like the last two we just did were about the hashtag Free Britney movement, so that's not really true crime in the sense that you might think of like Ted Bundy, who we've also covered, but it's definitely crime possibly happening against her. We don't know. I mean, we cover it in the show, but it's something that's in the news. That's people a million people, it's not even an exaggeration, DM'd us to talk about it. And so once we started looking into it, we're like, oh, there's something, a mystery here. Like, so it's anything that kind of piques our interest, as far as, like Christy said, it's a book club where we wanted to solve mysteries or solve crimes. So we're kind of doing it. We're like Scooby-Doo without the van. And instead of Scooby-Doo, Christy has a pet pig.
Yeah, we're working on the van. We're working on the van.
Well, I love it. So you guys, you mentioned a couple of times finding a format. How much work did you go into finding a format, or both of you do improv and comedy, so was it just a natural thing together, or if you really had to work on finding a format and a cadence?
As far as cadence, I think we have always naturally played off each other pretty well, and we performed together on stage and were really good friends before we started things. So, just having that natural banter going into it, I think helped us a lot. Regarding the format, in the beginning, if we go back and look at our notes for early episodes, I mean, we just laugh at how unusable they are at this point, because it's just like, we're like, what does this even mean? It's just bullet points of like random words. We don't even know what we were trying to say. And around episode 13 is when we really started fleshing out like a script that we write together that's based on research that we each independently do. So we kind of tell this story that is pre-written, and then at breaks within the story is when we banter with each other, tell personal stories that relate to whatever topic we're discussing and things like that. So I think probably around episode 13 is when we really started to figure that out.
I think the most important thing is we both like hearing stories the same way. So we would get frustrated either hearing other, not necessarily just podcasts, but even certain documentaries or TV shows, and they're like telling it out of order. And that works if you're, Quentin Tarantino. But sometimes for us, for a mystery, we're like, we want to start, they were born this day. This is how they grew up, especially with some of these more heinous criminals, or a criminal like we covered Aaron Rodriguez, who is someone who seemingly has it all, and then suddenly, starts committing crimes. It's like, well, if you start digging back in his childhood, it's not so sudden. So we liked that idea of saying, okay, let's start at the beginning. It makes me think of writing, a brief for a law case that you're going to do in law school, where it's like, what are the facts? This started this day. This is what happened. And then the banter kind of, like she said, comes off of that.
Well, I have to admit something. I do cheat on y'all some weeks. I listen to other podcasts,
That's
but
totally fine.
Same topics, but oftentimes, and actually, by the way, I have to say it, I get pissed. Well, and it's probably not justified, but I get so mad when I hear the podcast go, oh yeah, we totally got this from Sinisterhood. And I'm like, that's their work. Don't take it from them. So I like listening. Like, you're talking about the format. I love the format that y'all have, because I'm all about the background story, getting to know not just the legal aspects, Heather, like you like to dig into, but Christy, definitely when you bring talking about the psychological and kind of the history and how this all came about, as opposed to just the morbid portion of everything. So I like listening to other podcasts and supplement too, just to see what other people's perspective might be. But I kind of always start here just because the format is really good. I mean, it is a good comprehensive way to look at that. And actually you kind of mentioned it a little bit ago about the working together on research. So I'm assuming you guys are 50-50 on each episode, or do you tag team who does more work? What does that look like?
Well, we tag team it, I would say. There are some episodes where Heather probably contributes more notes. There are some episodes where I probably contribute more notes, but in my opinion, it all evens out in the end. And it's a team effort. So it doesn't really matter who's pulling the most work that week, because we know it'll balance out in the end. And in addition to that, we do split up the tasks of responding to social media, managing our Patreon, managing our merch store, Gmail, all sorts of things. So we kind of have a whole other side of the podcast going on in addition to just producing the show each week. So all in all, we've figured out that independently, we each spend about 30 to 35 hours working on the show, in addition to Heather being a full-time lawyer and me being a full-time mom. So it's definitely for us become transitioned into more of a job and a nice source of income as well.
Well, and that was one of the key things that I wanted to ask you ladies about, because I feel like you're pretty transparent. In the beginning of podcasting, I feel like you alluded to, oh, we're going to keep it ad free as much as possible. But then you transitioned to this monetized strategy, which, by the way, I was super thrilled that you did, because I know that a lot of work goes into it and you deserve to be compensated for your time. What made you decide to do that transition?
Well, I think it's like owning a billboard and not putting anything on it. We especially as the audience grew and then people started reaching out to us. I mean, our very first advertiser was a fan who created feminist kind of clothing, and some of it was kind of spooky and it kind of dovetailed with what we were doing. And so, we look at each other and we go, how much do we sell an ad for? I don't know. And we start Googling and trying to figure that out. And then from there, we got approached by a larger, a middleman kind of ad company where they say, okay, we're going to broker a deal. These are our clients. We think that they may like you. So it sort of was not handed to us, but I mean, it's sort of, they came knocking, and probably much earlier, we probably could have started pounding the pavement, but we were just plugging along, enjoying what we were doing. But now the more it's grown, and I think the more effort that we put into it, we've always put a ton of effort into the research, but then managing the Patreon, interacting with a much larger social media following, and especially with our Patreon specifically, it is such a not a drain on the time, but it's time that it takes away from doing the podcast, or I don't know, watching TV, sitting around, going for a walk. And so it does feel much more fulfilling when not only are you doing something that you love, but that, you can pay your student loans.
Sure. Yes.
And just for some context for the audience, you guys launched Sinisterhood in May 2018. Just 7 months later, the show broke into iTunes top 10 comedy podcast and also was a Spotify featured podcast. And then 10 months after launching, you had hit 1 million downloads, and now you're at over 10 million. So for me, it's not that this was just luck of the draw. Obviously, you had the fan base, and I agree with you. I think y'all could have done it sooner. Was there some internal resistance to being monetized sooner, or was it just kind of like, well, let's just see what happens?
I definitely do not recall a conversation where Heather and I said, let's not make money. So I don't think it was an internal resistance. With the ads, like she said, we I'm a kind of a pessimist at times. And I just assume it, and especially with podcasting as opposed to performing comedy live like we were used to doing, it's hard to gauge if people are really into what you're doing. I mean, you have download numbers to look at, and you can see how many people are following you on social media, although those numbers will never be as high as how many people are actually listening to you. So as Heather likes to say, we kind of feel sometimes like we're screaming into the void, especially in the beginning. We didn't know if people were super into it. So I think maybe in the beginning we just thought, well, I don't know if anybody would want to advertise on. I mean, when we broke into the top 10, I emailed our hosting site because I thought the download numbers were wrong, because I was convinced that there's no way we had done that yet, but we had. And, that's super fulfilling. It's just with a live comedy performance, you have an audience right there giving you feedback. With podcasting, unless people start writing reviews or contacting you, you don't really know how they feel about stuff. I do know with the Patreon, we had kind of toyed with that a bit, but then we really started thinking about doing that once people started reaching out to us, asking us if we had one that they could donate to. So when that happened, we were like, okay, people want to give us money. We're not going to say no. So let's figure this out. And we've really seen some growth with that over the past year and a half too, that we're really proud of.
Well,
But
and
we
also,
also do a lot of extra work for that too.
and I was going to say, initially, we didn't know what our downloads were because we were on Squarespace and we didn't have like a third party counter, and we didn't really. And so Chrissy is an amazing researcher as always, and was like, okay, here's all the podcast host companies, here's their costs, here's their benefits. And we ended up going with Fireside, and they've been able to give us, the accurate numbers, and they're compliant and everything, that we could then reach out on our behalf once we decided we wanted to monetize. And then once we looked at some websites that said, oh, if you have X many downloads, you can get this many dollars for an ad. And we're like, well, hell, what
Yeah.
are we sitting on?
Yeah. And we reached out to some friends that also have other successful podcasts to kind of get their take on stuff. So it's really been, completely self-taught. And I think that's important for anyone starting a podcast is if you want to do it, just do it, because, and you learn so much as you go, and the podcast that you think you might want to create at the beginning might transition into something totally else. But we've learned so much over the past 2 years to kind of get us where we are now. And we still learn all the time.
Do you visualize a specific type of listener when you're creating these, or are you really just going based on your gut, how you feel, and put it out there?
We only cover stuff that makes us interested, and I only try to say stuff to make Christy laugh.
Same. Yeah, that's a good question, though, as far as visualizing listeners. I know from our metrics that our listeners are primarily 18 to 34, and it's, I believe, 96% women. So that's who I envision when I think of who listens. But yeah, from the beginning, we've kind of always said, and I think we would both agree with this about anything. Like, if you're not passionate about it, then don't bother doing it, because it's not going to sell, like we have to be interested in it for our audience to be interested in it. So we only cover topics that we would want to do. We get requests for stuff all the time, and we say, like, we're sorry, we just don't cover that type of stuff because it's just not stuff we want to spend our time researching. While we're into morbid stuff, we have lines that we don't like to cross. We don't want to sit up all night reading about like the most horrific like child crimes that the world's ever seen. So, we don't do that kind of stuff. But as long as we're doing stuff that we like and we're making each other laugh, then that's all I'm concerned about.
So when you mention passion, I've noticed this on a few episodes, and I think I only noticed the editing because I do podcasting as well, but I can tell sometimes, and it's not poorly done at all, so Tommy, bravo, but I could tell that maybe you went too far off a topic and you cut it out or wanted to shorten it. What does the post-production process look like, or when you catch yourself going completely down a rabbit trail?
So post-production, once we record, I will go back and listen for edits, and then I write down every timestamp of where we need to edit something out, and I give it to Tommy, and he goes in and does that for us. We really don't edit out, and it might just be, and I'll talk to him about this, the way it's clipped together. We really don't edit out. I can't think of any time we've like cut a significant chunk of audio out or anything like that. It's usually because I stumble over the words I'm saying in the script a million times, or one of us bumps a mic, or a dog barks or something like that. So we really, very rarely do we edit out like actual content.
No, we got to keep that banter in.
Yeah.
Well, damn, I was like, what jewels are they leaving out and cutting out? Now the mystery's
Really
gone.
none. Yeah.
You get all the
jewels. We were saying we should have a blooper reel though. Not to put you on blast that you had a little blooper and we had to restart this at the beginning. But we were like, I think Tommy does actually clip out things where we do mess up or make each other laugh that doesn't make it into the show. So
well, I think he have a folder of like us burping into the mics and stuff.
Yeah. He has that folder.
Please do a blooper reel. That would make my pandemic. Please. That's awesome. So you mentioned a little bit ago, Christy, I believe, on reviews. How do y'all handle negative reviews? I mean, you kind of both have the attitude of what the F. I mean, is it really what the F, or how seriously do you take negative reviews?
I don't read reviews. And I don't believe Heather does either. I kind of, in the very beginning, when we were first starting out, we'd have like 10 10 new iTunes reviews, I'd read those or whatever. But then it got to be, like with anything, the bigger you get, the more people are listening and the more opinions are out there. And so I just don't want to read all that. I mean, 98% of the time it's good stuff people say, but the negative stuff, Heather and I are both kind of under the opinion of, if why bother consuming negative information if we're not going to change how we do things?
And one, I do try to avoid reading the iTunes reviews. Although when we first started, my mom would go, "You want to know what someone said about you?" And I was like, "No, I don't.
No,
Thanks."
don't. Please
But
don't tell us.
since I answer the social media, if someone tags us in something that's nasty, like I'm going to see it and I don't respond. We don't get into fights with people. If there's 10 million podcasts, if you don't like what I'm saying, turn it off. How about that? But this guy tweeted us maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and he said, "I hate podcasts like My Favorite Murder and Sinisterhood because they talk too much."
Oh my
And
God.
I thought, oh, honey, if you don't like talking, maybe a podcast isn't for you. But I couldn't help myself because it was such a bizarre thing to be pissed about. His whole entire page, he was yelling at Conan O'Brien and Beyonce and the NFL and Planet Fitness. He was mad at Comcast. And I thought, okay, this is just a person that's all they do. They're a professional griper. But so a lot of times, though, if I see something that's like nasty, I'll either block them or just straight up ignore them. Except for this one, I went down a rabbit trail of like, what is your life like? But for the most part, it's just like, you're not going to please everybody. And so what are we going to, like Chrissy said, even if it's a nice thing, we're not going to do more of that. We're going to do what we're going to do. And as far as I'm concerned, the two people that are most important to the show is me and Christy. Also, I mean, Tommy, obviously, because he like edits it. But I mean, as far as like content, like we're trying to make each other laugh. We're the ones on the air. So I think that's my thing is if Christy's happy, then I'm happy. And if somebody wants to tweet us, just go to town, sir.
Okay, that's
Also, I am personally thrilled to be on the same list as Beyonce, Comcast, and Conan O'Brien.
That's what I said. He was like yelling about the Popeyes chicken sandwich. I was like, everybody's talking about the Popeyes chicken sandwich. We have made it, you guys.
Yeah,
I wrote a whole blog post about it. I was so excited.
You're never gonna please everyone, but if you're pleasing the majority, and I say keep doing what you're doing, because if you start letting those negative, few and far between comments get to you, and if we, tweaked our show based on those, then there are going to be diehard listeners that have listened from the beginning that are like, I don't like this changes they've made. So, if the majority of the people like what you're doing, then if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
And I agree. And I think the same thing for when it comes to advertisers, kind of scooping back to what we talked about earlier. That was one of my apprehensions in the beginning of taking advertisers because I had a bad taste from dealing with a publisher. I get it, different formats, but I just was afraid of, being censored, first of all, but of having my scope of my conversation or how I presented myself being completely different. I love this. I hope that y'all listening that are going into podcasting or any other content creation, that you go check out Sinisterhood, listen to how, obviously they're passionate about the topics and it has resulted in, and I think that's my thing. I'm asking you questions and coaching you ladies down, like, what are these things on this like imaginary business checklist that you've done, but you're not subscribing to like a specific checklist. What is shining through is the commitment and the passion and obviously the talent to execute this. Which brings me to Heather. I have to know, attorney to attorney, how much additional legal research are you doing for these different podcasts? Because have you done criminal work? I remember there was an episode about space law at one point.
Well, I did do an internship at NASA. No, I'm kidding. I've never done space law. I studied aviation law a little bit in law school because I worked for a pilot at the time. So that was actually just a happenstance that I was familiar with that. But I do, for the notes that I give to Christy, I'll sometimes put in parentheses, like with all the conservatorship stuff with Britney Spears. I mean, I could have put paragraphs and paragraphs, and I just put in parentheses, I will talk about conservatorships out loud. And there was another one that we did. I can't remember what it was, but it was something to do with evidence that was being excluded in a trial. And maybe it was Amanda Knox. And I typed a whole long thing out. And Christy just said, can you just summarize this like verbally? Because it doesn't really make sense. If she's reading the script, she reads it out loud and then I talk about it. So she'll just be like, mention it and then kind of throw it to me. So I do, in addition to the notes that I type in, and I'll, put, a little side note to her, like, I can talk about X issue, then I'll go on my own, and I don't take notes on it that I put into the show outline. I just keep a little note for myself of stuff that I want to talk about. Like with the Britney Spears conservatorship stuff, like I had, sites to the probate code and things like that, and different names of the different forms that they filled out to get conservatorship over her and stuff like that. That didn't really need to be in the outline. But if, we were talking about, well, why would they say that she had dementia? And I'm like, oh, on this form, it asks this question and that form does this. So I do a lot of legal research that doesn't make it into the script part of it, just so, because early on I would just kind of do the bare minimum research for the script, and Christy would ask me a question. I go, well, damn it, I got to pause and look it up. I don't know, because I don't know laws of every jurisdiction, but I don't know quite when this will air, but in the future we're doing one that's an international law case. And so I turned my notes into Christy, and now I'm reading law review articles about kind of how the criminal justice system works in this other country, just so I'm more familiar with it and not having to pause and Google while we're in the middle of a show.
I know for me, I don't do criminal law. I'm all business. So I've
Same.
enjoyed having the nuggets of business law. I mean, I'm sorry, of criminal law in episodes, because that really helps me as the lawyer brain to have some context of really what's going on. And I'm sure, and I love the way that y'all explain the different things, especially when you go into evidence and talking about how maybe police departments have botched certain things because they would never do that. But it's nice to have that kind of context, not just the facts of the case, but the interpretation. And so do you have kind of a line of how far you'll go? I mean, you talk about making it a brief understanding. Is it just more of like a natural inclination? I mean, I feel like you're just a natural teacher of this stuff, or do you kind of have to rein yourself in as an attorney not to go too legal?
Well, I did. I was a assistant professor at the law school for about 2 years. So, and you can kind of tell when people get a glazed look in their eye, and it's great to record with another person, because if it were just me, I probably would just go and go and go. Whereas Christy will ask really great, thoughtful, juicy questions that'll get me going, and then bring it back to the topic at hand. So she's very good at kind of reining me in if I start going. But yeah, to answer your earlier question though, I don't have any criminal law experience except for interning for a federal judge that did like a federal criminal docket, but that's way different crimes than the crimes we cover.
Well, and Heather does a fantastic job of explaining all the legal stuff in a way that's really understandable to people that aren't lawyers and like myself. And so I think it's helpful that I don't have that background, because the questions I ask are hopefully also questions that listeners might be having while they're listening. But she explains the legalese in a really unpretentious, understandable way that I think that and the research that we do, I think really sets our podcast apart from others, because true crime genre is saturated, if you didn't know.
100%. And I think that's one of the things, is that when you're looking around trying to create a podcast, especially in a niche, like you said, that is so saturated, it's identifying what makes you happy, like y'all talked about, what makes you passionate, so you enjoy the 30-40 hours per week, but also how do you set yourself apart? And I feel like y'all probably have naturally set yourselves apart just with the comedy, with the crime and mystery, but also having the experience and I wouldn't say uncensored. It's not like you guys are uncouth in your thing, but you're kind of you let it all out, what you think and what you feel about the different topics. And I think that's really refreshing when there's so many similar podcasts. Well, podcasts in the similar field, but they're very cut and dry, cut to the facts, and that's kind of it. Awesome.
Yeah, I think we pride ourselves on, and it's just a natural thing, because this is both how we are, of being like very sensitive to victims and stories and everything. And we hear a lot from listeners that they really appreciate that too, because occasionally in true crime podcasts, people can get kind of amped up by the juicy details and stuff, and kind of forget that this was a person with a family, and like we should show some sensitivity to it. So I think that sets us apart. But like you said too, just kind of being friends and having natural comedic banter. And we're both researchers who really enjoy like well thought out, planned, sequential stories. So it kind of all just came together that, we produced something that we're proud of.
And I'm glad you mentioned that about being honoring and vigilant of how you showcase it because of the victims. Because I've had people say to me, probably when I've shared about your podcast or other crime podcasts, they're like, that's so morbid. Why would you use someone's worst day for your enjoyment?
Mhm.
And I've always stopped and gone, oh, damn, they kind of have a point.
Yeah, I agree. That is a good point, and that's one that we don't take lightly. So when we are talking about someone's the worst thing that's ever happened to someone's family or in their life, we always make sure to stay really compassionate about
Mm-hmm.
everything that they went through and never victim blame or, anytime that we're making, because, when people hear a true crime comedy, they're like, how can you be funny about true crime?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're not being funny about the crimes. We're being funny about ourselves and making fun of ourselves. So whatever the topic may be, it may remind us of something and kind of we springboard to like a personal story from our
Mm-hmm.
childhood. Like when Heather talked about her mom hitting her with the car, but like, but it was just to teach her a lesson, so it was fine.
Yeah.
So like we're not making fun of like the story we're telling or the people in the story. We're making fun of ourselves.
And I think there's also a tendency, not with all true crime podcasts, but just sort of in that the area of true crime, it starts to bend toward almost fandom for the
Mm-hmm.
perpetrators, and
Mm-hmm.
we are far away from that. And I think
Mhm.
really try to break down, all the stuff that they did and who they were and why they did what they did, but never say, "Oh, I love Ted Bundy. I'd love to have a T-shirt with his face." Like we don't get. It's really more into being respectful of the victims, and then also, acknowledging the monstrosities that these people did, and that
Mhm.
the victims didn't do anything to deserve it.
Hmm.
Well, and one of my takeaways as a listener, I'm not in this field, is I can look for things that would be red flags when I get into situations or to kind
Mhm.
of help teach my children or even my girlfriends, when you go to bars and this and that sort of thing, like looking for those types of red flags. But also, and I guess it's we're going kind of down a really like serious path, but recognizing the trauma that others
Mhm.
experience and just kind
Hmm.
of adding that humanistic point of it. And like you said, less about the fandom and more about connection with how the family's feeling and what can we do, and this is the lawyer part of me, what can we do as a society to not
Mhm.
have these sort of tragedies occur?
Mhm.
What is something we can do in our communities? Yeah, so that's, I mean, for me, like, yeah, those are like the heavy takeaways that I get. I mean, I love the comedy, especially one of my favorite stories is the diarrhea in the
Oh gosh.
Albertsons parking lot.
Yeah, that's a
I'm so
classic.
sorry.
That's episode 13. That's where it all starts.
Where it all starts. If y'all need a good one to start with to know what we're talking about with comedy, that is the perfect episode. So, all right. Well, ladies, this has been fabulous. Before we wrap up, if there's an aspiring podcaster listening, what is maybe a mistake or a change that you would make from the beginning, maybe from the first 13 episodes to now, that you would have changed?
Good question. Heather, I'm going to throw that to you while I think about it.
Don't try to record in a very echoey conference
That's
room.
true.
No, I would say just do what I would say don't reinvent the wheel. So go, what we did, I literally said I googled what equipment does Last Podcast on the Left use? And there was some article that they got written about talking about different microphones. And I googled what does Mark Maron's garage look like? Cuz if the Last Podcast guys are recording in the studio, I'm like we don't have that. For a while we've recorded in a studio just with a friend, but now we're going to have to do it in our house. What does Mark Maron do to soundproof his garage? And so we were Googling what other successful kind of things worked for kind of
Mhm.
do-it-yourselfers like us. Well, we're not going to go be in a professional studio. And so we didn't reinvent the wheel, but we did our own research. I didn't email Mark Maron and go, well, hey, man, what does your studio look like? I Googled it because there's a thing. You just ask a question of the internet and it tells you. So
Mhm.
I would say do that. Kind of find people that are doing something similar to you, like where he was doing it at home, and go down that path and kind of research that, because that helped us, although we started looking a little too late. It was after about 20 episodes.
Stand on the shoulders of giants. Yeah, I would say that um, from a technical standpoint, with your audio, do as much as you can beforehand to make your audio sound good. So you
Mhm.
have l- very little to do in post. So, yeah, soundproofing the room you're going to be in, looking in, and you don't have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on microphones and mixers and
Mhm.
stuff like that. And now they even have like podcast kits that are very very easy to set up and come in different price points. So just spend a little time researching that and trying to get your audio to sound as good as possible before you record, so you have less to do after. In addition, people always ask us, like, what's like the secret to doing this? And we're always like,
The
if we
secret of life.
knew, we would tell you. But I think for
We
us,
would have done it earlier.
yeah, I think for us, and what we always tell everyone is put out good, consistent content.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we really try to do. Remain consistent, so you're you're not falling off of people's radar, but also have it be something you're proud of, and have it be something that people are going to want to listen to.
And I actually have one question to dovetail off of this. And I'm not calling any other crime podcast out, but there was hullabaloo in the last few years about copyright infringement, plagiarism, failure to attribute things. And as an intellectual property attorney, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I was like, what? And listening to that podcast, what is your line for inspiration or quoting of sources? How do y'all package and present that?
Well, I always say that Christy's tougher than any law review professor or any partner I've worked at a big law firm. She's always like, where did this come from? Let's source it. Nothing that goes into the show is not our own language unless it's literally quoted and then it's highlighted in yellow and I do a dumb voice. And that's how you know we didn't write it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my undergrad degree is in creative nonfiction writing. So this is, right up my alley to write this type of stuff. And Christy's amazing researcher and puts it into our own words. So I don't know the path of others. I, as a lawyer and a person who is aware of lawsuits, I just cannot fathom putting something on the air that I myself did not write. But don't fall into that trap. I know some shows straight up just read off of Wikipedia, which I don't think. You're the IP lawyer. I don't think that's illegal, but I don't think then you could like publish the transcript and say that it's something you did. But yeah, everything that goes in. I mean, Christy, I'll send my notes in, and if I haven't clearly said according to blah 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 source, and then summarizing it, I'll literally get an all caps note from Christy that says source ? And then I go through and source it or whatever. So everything is sourced and footnoted, and we upload it to our website where there's a button that says show notes, and you can see all of our sources.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. I mean, not that I know of any other large podcasts that have done that. Just hypothetical question.
Hypothetically, though, is that like if someone started a podcast? This is me genuinely putting you on the spot. Can you just read Wikipedia? What's the deal with that? It doesn't seem.
The problem with like Wikipedia, it's like crowdsourced. So like who really owns it? And I honestly wouldn't rely on the legitimacy of Wikipedia. I'd probably use it kind of like an off the cuff at a bar type conversation to look at, or like a quick answer. But I wouldn't rest the content of my podcast or anything else. Maybe as a starting point, because oftentimes, it has footnotes and that sort of stuff and sources that you can click through, but I would not solely rely upon it. And it's really not protectable at that point because it's not your original work.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I don't mean like for if it's legit, but I mean if someone just read it off as and then presented it as their own, like then are you able to sell that podcast? Because you don't really like who owns it. I don't know. Interesting questions.
I mean, I just don't think it would be protectable at all. I don't know. That's a good question. Damn it, Heather.
I'm sorry, I stumped you. That's the worst thing. I'm lawyer to lawyer. That's the meanest thing I could have did. But I mean, that'll be a follow-up episode we'll do.
Yeah, I mean,
or a mini
gray area. I think the bottom line is knowing the source, like where it comes from, and getting inspiration. Even listening to other podcasts. I know y'all mentioned, have you seen the Netflix documentary? And even talk about the stuff that happens in the documentary. And you reference the director or the person being interviewed and that sort of stuff. And I think that is really good. It gives me context too, because then I'm like, oh, I have a documentary to watch tonight. But it provides it provides the audience a way to know that that's not your direct quote. It gives a good fun attribution without necessarily having to be like, then the sheriff said, quote, blah, 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 end quote. I mean, you guys weave it in really well. And I know that this is a huge thing when it comes with reporters, definitely. And that was part of what that big issue last year was. And I'm starting to see a lot more podcasters and YouTubers that are just reading off, like you said, articles, and it's popping up everywhere. So bottom line, if you're listening, if you're creating content, you can be inspired, but create it yourself. Don't sit there and just read off of an article and then try to claim it as your own.
Well, I think we don't fall into that because we do a lot of primary source research. Like I go to court filings and I'll read for the Britney Spears stuff. I was reading the motions and I was reading the files. So then it's me summarizing a court document. So you don't fall into that versus reading somebody else's article.
Yeah,
no,
I watch. I like to. We kind of have different styles of how we like to consume information. Heather likes to listen to a lot of audiobooks and stuff. I prefer like documentaries
Mhm.
and reading articles. So unless I had a transcript of the documentary, it's going to be summarized in my own words because,
Mhm.
you know, that's how we're consuming the information. But we also, like she said, we cite every single source. With this most recent Britney Spears one, there's probably 85 links
Wow.
of different things in our show notes that we used to gather all of our information. So, and that's published on our website as well. So anybody can go to that and see where we've pulled our
Mhm.
information to
Mhm.
make sure it's factual.
We're just both very anal retentive. So
That's true. Yes. And also Heather does not want us to get sued. So
and I personally
we
don't want to get disbarred. So
yeah. So we make a point to say, these are our opinions. You can't sue somebody for having an opinion. And then
Mhm.
anything that is, more in the script that is factual, we're getting from other resources that have vetted where they got that from.
Mhm. And it's all about credibility. This even circles back to talking about having advertisers and building an audience base. Like I said, I'll listen on one topic, 3 or 4 different podcasts within the same time period, as well as the documentary, and I'll hear conflicting information and I'll go, well, who was right? Of course, I
Mm-hmm.
obviously rely on you ladies. That's my primary source. But I'll go, wait a minute. They said like 4 witnesses. That one said 2 witnesses. And so I think it's also about being consistent in the credibility. And once you lose that, maybe your audience so much may not necessarily care. I don't know what happened with that other major podcast. I fell off, but then I'm an IP lawyer. Like, I'm not all about supporting someone that does that. But advertisers are definitely not going to be doling out cash to support someone that has that type of controversy.
I just would worry about liability. Not that, or like you said, reputational problems. But I don't know.
Mhm.
Sometimes people are juggernauts. Something may not take them down. So could work out.
We also because we research stuff independently, and there are times where Heather's
Mm-hmm.
notes will say there were 4 witnesses, blah blah blah, and then I'll read something where it was there are 2, and I don't know which one of us. I'm not going to say she's wrong and I'm right, so
Mhm.
we'll just put in the outline conflicting reports. Some say there are 4, some say there are
Mhm.
2, and then we'll cite the sources because, like you said, it's hard to know who's right, and it's not really up to us to make that call.
Mhm. Mhm. I love that. Well, ladies, thank you so much for taking your time. I know extremely busy putting out great content, dealing and interacting with everyone that you need to get the information to. I appreciate this so much. All y'all listening, if you are interested in podcasting, this is an episode to re-listen to. Good nuggets out of it. As always, hop into the Business Bites Facebook group. We will have a dedicated thread to this, and you can share about your podcast or other content creation sources, and any tips, tricks, or any advisements that you may have for the other members of the group would be fabulous. And I will talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for joining Rachel on this episode of the Business Bites. For show notes, a list of recommended tools, or referenced episodes, you can find them at businessbitespodcast.com. Until next time.